The morning sun cast long shadows across the runway at Bagram Airfield as Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell completed her pre-flight checks on her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The massive GAU-8 cannon protruded from the nose like a steel beast ready to strike, while her hands moved with practiced efficiency across the familiar controls. After 18 months in Afghanistan, every rivet and panel of her Warthog felt like an extension of herself. Sarah had earned her call sign Phoenix not through bravado or luck, but through grit and an uncanny ability to bring damaged aircraft home when others would have ejected. Her squadron mates respected her, though she knew some of the newer pilots still questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit of the Air Force's premier close air support aircraft. She let her flying do the talking. The mission briefing had been routine. Provide close air support for a special operations team conducting a high-value target capture in the remote mountains near the Pakistani border. The terrain was unforgiving, with jagged peaks that could hide enemy fighters and weather that changed faster than a politician's promise. Sarah had flown dozens of similar missions, but something about today felt different. As she taxied toward the runway, her radio crackled with the familiar voice of her wingman, Lieutenant Jake Bulldog Harrison. The young pilot had been flying with her for 3 months and had proven himself capable, though he still carried the eager enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet seen the worst the war could offer. "Phoenix, you copying the weather update?" Bulldog's voice carried a note of concern. "Looks like we might hit some serious cloud cover over the target area." Sarah checked her instruments and reviewed the meteorological data streaming across her display. "Copy that, Bulldog. Nothing we haven't handled before. Stay tight on my wing and follow my lead if visibility drops." The mission proceeded smoothly for the first 2 hours. They maintained a steady orbit over the designated area while the Special Operations Team moved into position. Sarah's eyes constantly swept the sky and ground below, watching for any sign of threat. The A-10's robust design and powerful engines made her feel invincible, but she knew complacency killed more pilots than enemy fire. The first indication of trouble came through her headset as the mission commander's voice cut through the static. "Hawkeye 1-1, be advised we have multiple fast movers approaching your position from the east. Estimate 4 F-16s. Friendly call sign Viper Flight." Sarah frowned as she scanned her radar display. She hadn't been briefed about any F-16s operating in their area, and the timing seemed odd. The Fighting Falcons were primarily air-to-air fighters, not typically used for close air support missions in mountainous terrain where the A-10 excelled. "Viper Flight, this is Hawkeye 1-1, she transmitted on the common frequency. "We're currently supporting troops in contact in Grid Square Papa Romeo 7-4. Please state your intentions." The response came back with an edge of authority that immediately raised Sarah's guard. "Hawkeye 1-1, this is Viper Lead. You are directed to clear the airspace immediately. We have priority tasking in this area." Sarah exchanged a glance with her wingman, though separated by hundreds of yards of air. The request made no sense. Their mission had been approved through proper channels, and the ground team was depending on their support. More importantly, no one had the authority to simply order them out of assigned airspace without going through command channels. "Viper Lead, negative," Sarah replied firmly. "We are tasked with close air support for ongoing ground operations. Recommend you contact Tactical Air Control for deconfliction." What happened next would be remembered in Air Force circles for years to come. Instead of the professional coordination expected between military pilots, Viper Lead's response dripped with condescension. "Listen here, Hawkeye. This isn't a training exercise, and we don't have time to babysit some nugget pilot who can't follow simple instructions. You're flying a museum piece that has no business in contested airspace. Clear out now, or we'll escort you out." The radio fell silent, except for the constant hum of electronic systems. Sarah felt her jaw clench as the insult registered. She had more combat hours in the A-10 than most pilots accumulated in their entire careers, and her aircraft had saved countless lives while absorbing damage that would have destroyed lesser machines. Being called a nugget, military slang for an inexperienced pilot, by someone who didn't even know her record was beyond insulting. Before Sarah could respond, Bulldog's voice cut through her anger. "Phoenix, I'm seeing 4 F-16s approaching from our 2 o'clock position. They're moving to intercept." Sarah looked up to see the sleek silhouettes of the fighting Falcons cutting through the sky with the predatory grace of their namesake. The F-16s were beautiful machines, designed for speed and agility, but they lacked the staying power and resilience of her beloved Warthog. More importantly, their pilots lacked the patience and precision required for close air support missions. "Viper Lead, this is Hawkeye 1-1. Sarah transmitted with ice-cold professionalism. "I am a combat pilot conducting an approved mission in support of ground forces. Your unprofessional conduct is noted and will be reported. Recommend you review your rules of engagement before making threats against friendly aircraft." The F-16s closed the distance rapidly, their superior speed allowing them to maneuver around Sarah's formation with ease. Through her canopy, she could see the lead Falcon moving into position directly in front of her aircraft. The message was clear: land or be forced down. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could comply with their demands and abandon the ground team, potentially leaving soldiers without air support when they needed it most. She could attempt to evade, though the F-16's speed advantage made that unlikely to succeed. Or she could stand her ground and force them to escalate a situation that was already spinning out of control. The decision was made for her when the ground commander's voice crackled through her headset with desperate urgency. "Hawkeye 1-1, we are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We need immediate close air support. Over." Sarah keyed her microphone without hesitation. "Ground unit, this is Hawkeye 1-1. I copy heavy contact. Maintaining position to provide support. Stand by for immediate assistance." Viper Lead's response was swift and final. "Hawkeye 1-1, you are ordered to proceed immediately to Kandahar Airfield for landing. This is not a request." The threat was unmistakable. The F-16s had positioned themselves to force Sarah toward the distant airfield, effectively removing her from the fight and abandoning the ground team to whatever fate awaited them. It was a betrayal of everything she had sworn to uphold as a military pilot. As the F-16s began herding her aircraft away from the operational area, Sarah made a decision that would define not only her career, but her character. She would comply with their demands to avoid an international incident, but she would ensure that every detail of this encounter was documented and reported. The ground team would have to rely on other assets, and she would face whatever consequences came from this confrontation. But as her Warthog descended toward Kandahar under the watchful eyes of the F-16s, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Viper Flight had made a significant error in judgment. They had focused so intently on the aircraft and the pilot they perceived as inferior that they had failed to ask the most important question. Who exactly was Captain Sarah Mitchell, and what did her tail number represent? The landing at Kandahar was tense and silent. Sarah taxied her A-10 to the designated parking area while the F-16s maintained their escort formation until the very last moment. Ground crews rushed to secure her aircraft, their faces reflecting the confusion that had spread through the base as word of the unusual arrival spread. As Sarah shut down her engines and began her post-flight procedures, she noticed a growing crowd of personnel gathering near her aircraft. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when it involved the forced landing of a combat aircraft by friendly forces. The situation was unprecedented and would require immediate investigation. Climbing down from her cockpit, Sarah was met by the base operations officer, a colonel whose expression mixed curiosity with concern. Behind him stood representatives from intelligence, maintenance, and command staff, all eager to understand what had transpired in the sky above Afghanistan. "Captain Mitchell," the colonel began, "we need a complete briefing on the events that led to your unscheduled arrival." This is highly irregular, and we need to understand exactly what happened up there." Sarah nodded, her mind already organizing the sequence of events for her report. But before she could speak, a commotion near the F-16s drew everyone's attention. The Viper flight pilots had dismounted their aircraft and were walking toward her position with the confident stride of pilots who believed they had just completed a successful mission. The lead pilot, a major with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, approached with his helmet under his arm and what appeared to be a satisfied expression. It was clear he expected recognition for his decisive action in removing what he perceived as an inexperienced pilot from a dangerous situation. "Colonel," the major said as he reached the group. "Major Rick Thompson, Viper Flight Lead. We successfully escorted an inexperienced A-10 pilot out of contested airspace where she was endangering ongoing operations. The situation has been resolved." Sarah watched the exchange with growing anger, but maintained her military bearing. The major's casual dismissal of her experience and capabilities was exactly the kind of attitude that had created this situation in the first place. But she knew that emotion would not serve her well in the investigation that was sure to follow. The colonel looked between the two pilots, clearly recognizing that there were two very different versions of events that needed to be reconciled. "Major Thompson, Captain Mitchell, I want both of you in my office in 30 minutes for a complete debrief. This situation requires immediate clarification and proper documentation." As the group began to disperse, Sarah remained beside her aircraft, running her hand along the familiar surface of the A-10's fuselage. The Warthog had brought her home safely once again, just as it had countless times before, but this time was different. This time, she had been forced to abandon a mission and potentially compromise the safety of ground forces. The irony was not lost on her that the very aircraft Major Thompson had dismissed as a museum piece was specifically designed for the kind of close air support mission they had been conducting. The A-10's ability to fly low and slow, absorb enemy fire, and deliver precise munitions made it ideally suited for supporting troops in contact. The F-16s, despite their advanced capabilities, simply could not match the Warthog's effectiveness in that specific role. As Sarah walked toward the operations building for her debrief, she passed a maintenance technician who was examining her aircraft's tail number with unusual interest. The young airman looked up at her with a mixture of recognition and something approaching awe. "Ma'am," the technician said quietly, "is this really tail number 78-0691? Sarah paused, struck by the intensity in the young man's voice. "That's correct, Airman. Why do you ask?" The technician's eyes widened as he looked from the numbers on her aircraft back to her face. "Ma'am, my grandfather served in the Air Force. He told me stories about this particular aircraft. If I'm right about what this tail number represents, then those F-16 pilots just made the biggest mistake of their careers." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, not from the wind across the tarmac, but from the realization that the confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The tail number that Major Thompson and his flight had ignored in their rush to assert dominance would soon become the center of a conversation that would reach the highest levels of the Air Force command structure. As she entered the operations building, Sarah knew that the next few hours would determine not only her future in the Air Force, but also whether the institutional arrogance that had led to this confrontation would be addressed or allowed to continue. The Warthog had been forced to land, but the real battle was just beginning. The operations briefing room at Kandahar buzzed with tension as Colonel James Morrison reviewed the preliminary reports from both pilot groups. 23 years of Air Force service had taught him to read between the lines of military reports, and the conflicting accounts before him suggested a situation far more complex than a simple airspace deconfliction issue. Sarah sat across from Major Thompson, maintaining her composure despite the barely concealed hostility radiating from the F-16 pilot. Thompson's wingmen flanked him. their expressions suggesting they viewed this debrief as a formality before receiving commendations for their decisive action. "Let me ensure I understand the sequence of events," Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the measured tone of an experienced officer. "Major Thompson, you're claiming that Captain Mitchell was operating beyond her capabilities in contested airspace and posed a danger to ongoing operations?" Thompson leaned forward confidently. "That's correct, sir. The A-10 is fundamentally unsuited for modern combat environments. Captain Mitchell's presence in that airspace represented a significant liability that could have compromised our mission effectiveness." Sarah felt her jaw tighten but remained silent. The colonel's eyes shifted to her. "Captain Mitchell, your account differs significantly from Major Thompson's assessment. You maintain that you were conducting an approved close air support mission?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied firmly. "My wingman and I were providing direct support for a special operations team that had made contact with enemy forces. Our mission was approved through proper channels and coordinated with tactical air control. At no point were we informed of any F-16 operations in our assigned area." Thompson scoffed audibly. "Colonel, with respect, the captain's inexperience is evident in her inability to recognize a dynamic tactical situation. Modern warfare requires rapid adaptation and decisive action, not the plodding approach of Cold War-era aircraft and tactics." The comment hung in the air like an undetonated bomb. Sarah's eyes flashed with controlled anger, but before she could respond, Colonel Morrison raised his hand for silence. His expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching interest. "Major Thompson," the colonel said slowly, "did you examine Captain Mitchell's aircraft identification before initiating your intercept?" Thompson waved dismissively. "Sir, the aircraft type was sufficient identification. A-10s are inherently limited in their operational scope. The specific tail number was irrelevant to our tactical assessment." Colonel Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. It was a subtle change, but Sarah recognized the expression of an officer who had just identified a critical error in judgment. The colonel turned to his aide. "Lieutenant Davis, please retrieve the complete service record for A-10 tail number 78@0691. The young lieutenant's fingers flew across his computer keyboard, his face growing increasingly animated as information populated his screen. After several moments, he looked up with an expression of barely contained amazement. "Sir," Lieutenant Davis began, his voice carrying a note of reverence, "tail number 780691 has one of the most distinguished service records in the entire A-10 fleet. This aircraft has been continuously operational since 1979 and has accumulated over 8,000 combat hours across multiple theaters." Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing that the briefing was taking an unexpected direction. "Colonel, regardless of the aircraft's history, the tactical situation required immediate action." Colonel Morrison held up his hand again. His attention focused on the lieutenant. "Continue with the record, Davis." "Sir, this particular A-10 was present at the Battle of Khafji during the Persian Gulf War, where it provided critical close air support that helped repel the Iraqi offensive. The aircraft sustained significant battle damage, but continued flying missions throughout the campaign." Sarah remained silent, but she felt a familiar surge of pride in her aircraft. She had known about the Warthog's Gulf War service, but hearing it recounted in an official briefing added weight to what Thompson had dismissed as obsolete technology. Lieutenant Davis continued reading from his screen. "During Operation Enduring Freedom, tail number 780691 participated in the initial strikes against Taliban positions. The aircraft has been credited with saving over 200 American lives through precision close air support missions." The room had grown noticeably quieter. Even Thompson's wingmen were beginning to look uncomfortable as the magnitude of the aircraft's service record became apparent. "But, sir," Lieutenant Davis said, his voice dropping to an almost whispered tone, The most significant entry in this aircraft's record concerns the pilot who flew it during the opening phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Colonel Morrison leaned forward. Continue, Lieutenant. Sir, this aircraft was flown by Captain Kim Campbell during the famous Baghdad mission where she sustained catastrophic hydraulic failure after taking direct hits from Iraqi surface-to-air missiles. Captain Campbell managed to fly the aircraft back to base using only manual reversion controls, a feat that aviation experts considered virtually impossible. The silence in the room was now complete. Even Thompson had stopped his dismissive gesturing, his expression shifting from confidence to something approaching concern. Sarah had heard the story countless times, but it never failed to inspire her. Captain Campbell's successful landing of a severely damaged A-10 using backup flight controls had become legendary in the Air Force community. The incident had demonstrated not only the remarkable resilience of the A-10 design, but also the exceptional skill required to master the aircraft in extreme conditions. Lieutenant, Colonel Morrison continued, what happened to Captain Campbell after that mission? Sir, Captain Campbell was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions. She continued flying combat missions and eventually rose through the ranks. She's currently serving as a colonel in the Air Force. Thompson cleared his throat, clearly attempting to regain control of the narrative. Colonel Morrison, while Captain Campbell's actions were certainly commendable, they don't change the tactical realities of today's combat environment. But Colonel Morrison wasn't finished. Lieutenant Davis, is there any additional information about tail number 780691's recent operational history? The lieutenant's eyes widened as he scrolled through additional entries. Sir, yes. This aircraft has been assigned to the 75th Fighter Squadron for the past 18 months. During that period, it has been involved in over 150 close air support missions with a perfect mission success rate. Thompson's confidence was now visibly shaken. Sir, I'm sure the statistics are impressive, but— Major Thompson, Colonel Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying a sharp edge of authority. Did you or any member of your flight attempt to verify the operational status or mission parameters of the aircraft you intercepted? The question cut through Thompson's protests like a blade. The proper procedure for any intercept included identification, verification, and communication with tactical air control to ensure coordination between friendly forces. Thompson's failure to follow established protocols was becoming increasingly apparent. Sir, the tactical situation required immediate action, Thompson repeated, but his voice now carried a note of uncertainty. Colonel Morrison turned his attention to Sarah. Captain Mitchell, you mentioned that you were supporting a special operations team in contact. What was the outcome of that engagement after your departure? Sarah's expression darkened. Sir, the ground team was forced to withdraw without completing their primary objective. They sustained 2 casualties during the extraction, though both were non-fatal. The high-value target they were pursuing escaped during the confusion. The weight of Thompson's decision began to settle on the room like a heavy blanket. By forcing Sarah to abandon her mission, Viper Flight had not only violated proper procedures, but had directly contributed to the failure of a critical special operations mission. Colonel Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where both Sarah's A-10 and Thompson's F-16s sat like silent witnesses to the confrontation. After a long moment, he turned back to face the assembled pilots. Major Thompson, your actions today represent a failure of leadership, judgment, and professional conduct that I find deeply troubling. You intercepted a friendly aircraft without proper authorization, forced the abandonment of an approved mission, and contributed to the failure of a special operations objective. Thompson's face had gone pale, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his earlier confidence. Sir, I was acting on what I believe to be the best interests of the mission. Your beliefs, Major, were founded on assumptions rather than facts. You assumed that an A-10 pilot must be inexperienced. You assumed that older aircraft technology was inherently inferior. Most critically, you assumed that you had the authority to override established mission parameters without consulting proper command channels. Sarah watched the exchange with professional detachment, but internally she felt a deep satisfaction at seeing Thompson's arrogance finally confronted with reality. The Major's dismissive attitude toward her and her aircraft had been based on prejudice rather than professional assessment. Colonel Morrison returned to his seat and fixed Thompson with a steady gaze. "Major, you and your flight are confined to quarters pending a full investigation into this incident. You are not to discuss this matter with anyone outside of official channels." Thompson opened his mouth to protest, but the colonel's expression stopped him before he could speak. With visible effort, the Major composed himself and nodded curtly. "Yes, sir." As Thompson and his wingmen filed out of the briefing room, Colonel Morrison turned his attention back to Sarah. "Captain Mitchell, I want your complete written report on my desk within 2 hours. Include every detail of your interaction with Viper Flight, from first contact through your forced landing." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "Colonel, may I ask what the next steps will be?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Captain, this incident is going to generate significant interest at very high levels of command. The forced abandonment of a special operations mission by friendly aircraft is unprecedented in recent military history. You can expect that your actions and those of Major Thompson will be scrutinized extensively." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Military investigations could take months to complete, and careers could be destroyed or enhanced based on their findings. But she was confident that the facts would support her version of events. As she prepared to leave the briefing room, Colonel Morrison called her name. "Captain Mitchell, one more thing. The maintenance chief informed me that your aircraft requires inspection after the forced flight to Kandahar. While you're here, I'd like you to speak with some of our newer pilots about close air support tactics." Sarah paused at the door. "Sir?" "Captain, this base has several young F-16 pilots who could benefit from understanding the true capabilities of the A-10 and the expertise required to employ it effectively. Perhaps it's time to bridge the gap between the fast mover community and the close air support specialists." As Sarah walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft, she noticed a small group of pilots and maintainers gathered around the A-10's tail section. Word of the aircraft's distinguished service record had spread quickly through the base, and personnel were examining the tail number with new understanding. A young F-16 pilot approached her as she reached her aircraft. "Captain Mitchell, I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez. I just wanted to apologize for what happened today. Major Thompson doesn't represent all of us." Sarah studied the young pilot's earnest expression and recognized something she had once seen in her own mirror: the desire to prove oneself worthy of wearing Air Force wings. "Lieutenant, every aircraft in our inventory has a specific mission and purpose. The key to being an effective pilot is understanding not just your own capabilities, but those of your teammates as well." As the sun set over Kandahar Airfield, Sarah completed her inspection of tail number 78-0691. The Warthog showed no signs of stress from the day's events, its robust design having absorbed the confrontation as easily as it had absorbed enemy fire in countless previous missions. But Sarah knew that the real test was yet to come. The investigation into Thompson's actions would undoubtedly reach higher command levels, and the outcome would send a message throughout the Air Force about the value of experience, the importance of following proper procedures, and the dangers of making assumptions based on prejudice rather than facts. The Warthog had been forced to land, but in doing so, it had exposed a deeper problem within the Air Force community. The resolution of that problem would determine whether the service could truly integrate its diverse aircraft capabilities or continue to be divided by the very arrogance that had created today's confrontation. 3 weeks after the forced landing at Kandahar, the investigation's preliminary findings had reached the Pentagon, creating ripples that extended far beyond a simple confrontation between fighter pilots. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of a C-130 transport aircraft, watching the mountains of Afghanistan disappear beneath the clouds as she traveled to Bagram for what would prove to be the most important briefing of her military career. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of incidents involving F-16 pilots dismissing A-10 capabilities, though none had escalated to the level of Thompson's actions. The Air Force leadership recognized that the confrontation represented a deeper cultural divide that threatened the service's effectiveness in combined operations. At Bagram, Sarah was met by Colonel Susan Martinez, the wing commander, whose reputation for fairness and tactical expertise had earned respect throughout the Air Force community. As they walked toward the command building, Colonel Martinez briefed Sarah on the developments that had emerged during her absence. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Martinez began, "the investigation has concluded that Major Thompson's actions constituted a serious violation of established procedures and endangered both mission success and personnel safety. However, the implications extend beyond individual accountability." Sarah listened carefully, understanding that her role in the incident was about to evolve into something much larger. "Ma'am, what does that mean for my career and future assignments?" "Captain, your conduct throughout this incident has been exemplary. Your adherence to proper procedures while under extreme pressure, combined with your extensive combat experience, has attracted attention at the highest levels of Air Force leadership." They entered a conference room where Sarah was surprised to see several general officers, including General Robert Hayes, the commander of Air Combat Command, participating via video conference from Langley Air Force Base. The presence of such senior leadership indicated that the incident had indeed reached the very top of the Air Force hierarchy. General Hayes spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded aircraft in multiple conflicts. "Captain Mitchell, I've reviewed the complete record of the incident, including the aftermath. Your professionalism in an impossible situation reflects the best traditions of Air Force aviation." Sarah maintained her composure, though internally she felt the weight of addressing such senior officers. "Thank you, sir. I was simply doing my job and following established procedures." "Captain," General Hayes continued, "that's exactly the point. In a service that prides itself on discipline and adherence to proper procedures, Major Thompson's actions represent a breakdown of the systems we depend on for operational effectiveness." Colonel Martinez activated a presentation display that showed a map of Afghanistan with various air operations plotted across the terrain. "Captain Mitchell, we want to discuss the broader implications of what happened and how we can prevent similar incidents in the future." The briefing revealed that Thompson's dismissive attitude toward A-10 capabilities was not unique. Survey data from multiple bases had identified a concerning trend of newer fighter pilots viewing close air support aircraft as obsolete, despite the A-10's proven effectiveness in the ground support role. "The reality," General Hayes explained, "is that modern air warfare requires integration of multiple aircraft types, each with specific capabilities optimized for different missions. The F-16 is an exceptional multi-role fighter, but it cannot replace the A-10's unique advantages in close air support operations." Sarah was then shown classified footage from her own missions over the past 18 months. The videos demonstrated the A-10's ability to operate in weather conditions that would ground other aircraft, its capacity to absorb battle damage while continuing missions, and its precision in delivering ordnance in close proximity to friendly forces. "Captain," Colonel Martinez said, "what we're seeing here is the difference between theoretical capability and practical application. On paper, an F-16 can deliver similar ordnance loads. In practice, the pilot training, aircraft design, and operational procedures of the A-10 make it irreplaceable for certain mission types." The briefing continued with an analysis of the Special Operations mission that had been compromised by Thompson's intervention. The high-value target who had escaped during the confusion had since been linked to several subsequent attacks on coalition forces. The cost of Thompson's arrogance was measured not just in professional embarrassment, but in American lives. General Hayes leaned forward in his video conference display. "Captain Mitchell, we're implementing several changes based on this incident. First, we're establishing mandatory cross-training programs where F-16 pilots will fly missions with A-10 units to better understand close air support operations." Sarah nodded, recognizing the value of such training. Many of the misconceptions about A-10 capabilities stemmed from lack of direct experience with the aircraft's unique operational profile. Second, the general continued, we're creating new protocols for airspace deconfliction that will prevent unauthorized intercepts of friendly aircraft. No pilot will have the authority to force another American aircraft to land without specific authorization from Tactical Air Control. Colonel Martinez added, "Most importantly, Captain, we want you to lead the development of these new training programs. Your combination of combat experience and demonstrated professionalism makes you the ideal candidate to bridge the gap between different aircraft communities." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The assignment would mean transitioning from purely operational flying to a role that combined flying with instruction and program development. It was a significant career opportunity, but it also meant leaving behind the pure focus on close air support missions that she loved. "Ma'am," Sarah asked carefully, "what happened to Major Thompson and his flight?" General Hayes's expression grew stern. "Major Thompson has been reassigned to a desk position pending completion of remedial training in joint operations procedures. His wingmen received formal reprimands and additional training requirements. Thompson's career progression has been significantly impacted." The meeting continued for 2 more hours, covering detailed plans for the new training programs and Sarah's role in their implementation. When it concluded, Sarah found herself walking across the Bagram flight line toward her waiting A-10, her mind processing the magnitude of the changes ahead. As she approached tail number 780691, she found Lieutenant Rodriguez, the young F-16 pilot who had apologized to her at Kandahar, standing beside her aircraft. He was examining the battle damage patches that told the story of the A-10's resilience under fire. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Sarah called as she approached. "What brings you to Bagram?" The young pilot turned with a respectful expression. "Ma'am, I volunteered for the cross-training program. After what happened with Major Thompson, I realized how much I don't know about close air support operations." Sarah smiled, recognizing in Rodriguez the same eagerness to learn that had driven her own development as a pilot. "Lieutenant, would you like to see what the A-10 can really do?" Over the next hour, Sarah provided Rodriguez with a comprehensive tour of her aircraft, explaining the design features that made it uniquely suited for close air support. She showed him the titanium bathtub that protected the pilot from ground fire, the redundant flight control systems that allowed the aircraft to fly with significant battle damage, and the massive GAU-8 cannon that could destroy enemy armor with surgical precision. "Captain," Rodriguez said as they completed the tour, "I had no idea the A-10 was this sophisticated. In the F-16 community, we always heard it was just a simple, slow aircraft." Sarah laughed, remembering her own early misconceptions about different aircraft types. "Lieutenant, simplicity in design often means sophistication in purpose. The A-10 was designed to do one thing better than any other aircraft in the world: support ground forces in contact with the enemy." As they talked, other pilots began gathering around the aircraft. Word had spread about Sarah's new assignment and the training programs being developed. Pilots from various aircraft types were expressing interest in better understanding each other's capabilities. A senior F-16 pilot, Major Lisa Chen, approached the group with obvious curiosity. "Captain Mitchell, I've been flying F-16s for 8 years, and I've never actually talked to an A-10 pilot about tactics and procedures. Most of what I know comes from secondhand information. Sarah realized that the incident with Thompson had revealed a fundamental problem in Air Force culture. Different aircraft communities had become isolated from each other, leading to misunderstanding and prejudice rather than mutual respect and cooperation. "Major Chen," Sarah said, "that's exactly what we're going to fix. The new training programs will involve F-16 pilots flying backseat in A-10s during actual close air support missions, and A-10 pilots will participate in F-16 air-to-air training to understand the challenges of fighter operations." The conversation continued as more pilots joined the group. Sarah found herself explaining A-10 capabilities and tactics to an audience that was genuinely interested in learning. The dismissive attitudes that had characterized Thompson's approach were notably absent. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base, addressing the first class of integrated fighter pilots participating in the new cross-training program. The room contained an equal mix of F-16 and A-10 pilots, working together to develop combined tactics that leveraged each aircraft's strengths. The program had exceeded all expectations. F-16 pilots who completed A-10 training returned to their units with a deep appreciation for close air support complexities, while A-10 pilots who participated in fighter training gained valuable insights into air superiority operations. "The lesson we learned from the Afghanistan incident," Sarah told the assembled pilots, "is that our effectiveness as an Air Force depends not on proving that one aircraft is superior to another, but on understanding how different capabilities work together to achieve mission success." The presentation included case studies of successful joint operations, where F-16s provided air superiority while A-10s delivered close air support, creating a layered defense that enemy forces could not counter. The integration of capabilities had proven far more effective than either aircraft type operating independently. After the briefing, Sarah walked outside to find tail number 780691 parked alongside the F-16s of the training squadron. The visual contrast between the sleek fighters and the robust attack aircraft perfectly illustrated the Air Force's diversity of capabilities. Lieutenant Rodriguez, now promoted and serving as an instructor in the program, approached with a broad smile. "Captain, I just wanted to thank you for what you've built here. This program has completely changed how I think about air operations." Sarah looked at the mixed formation of aircraft and felt deep satisfaction at what had emerged from the confrontation over Afghanistan. Thompson's arrogance had inadvertently triggered reforms that made the entire Air Force more effective. "Rodriguez," Sarah said, "the real credit goes to tail number 780691 and all the pilots who flew her before me. That aircraft's service record spoke louder than any argument I could have made." As the sun set over Nellis, Sarah reflected on the journey from that confrontational morning over Afghanistan to the collaborative training environment now flourishing in Nevada. The Warthog had been forced to land, but in doing so, it had forced the Air Force to confront its own assumptions and prejudices. The tail number that Thompson had dismissed as irrelevant had carried the weight of decades of distinguished service, flown by pilots whose courage and skill had saved countless lives. By forcing that aircraft to land, Thompson had unknowingly challenged not just Sarah, but the entire legacy of close air support aviation. The investigation and subsequent reforms had vindicated not just Sarah's actions, but the value of every pilot who had ever strapped into an A-10 to support ground forces in harm's way. The forced landing had become a symbol of resilience, both for the aircraft and the community of pilots who flew it. Sarah climbed into her cockpit for the evening training flight, knowing that somewhere over the Nevada desert, F-16 and A-10 pilots were learning to work together as a team. The silence that had followed Thompson's first sight of her tail number had been replaced by the sound of cooperation, respect, and mutual understanding. The Warthog's engines roared to life, ready for another mission. But this time, she wouldn't be flying alone. This time, she would be leading a formation that proved the Air Force's greatest strength lay not in the dominance of any single aircraft, but in the integration of all its capabilities under the leadership of pilots who understood that excellence comes from working together, not from working apart.